Good afternoon, everyone. So we're ready to start. It's always wonderful to have a full house as we do today. My name's Mark Maloney. I'm the Vice Dean and Executive Director of the Paris School of International Affairs. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's talk. We've got Adrien, who's going to moderate and introduce our speaker. But let me also just ask you to give a warm welcome back to Sciences Po to Ambassador Stéphane Dion, who did his PhD here a while ago. And he's here now to speak to you about, obviously, a very important issue. So welcome back to you, to Sciences Po. Adrien, thank you so much for agreeing to moderate. I hand over to you immediately so you can introduce the session. And welcome to everyone.
Yes, thank you very much. As has been stated, we're very happy to have Mr. Dion, Mr. Ambassador Dion, who is Prime Minister's Special Envoy to the European Union and in Europe, and Ambassador of Canada to France. And he represents an important topic that is being taught at PSIA this year on climate change and security. So we're very happy to hear from him, and it will be around 20 minutes talk, if we are correct, and then we will have the opportunity to ask questions to Mr. Dion. So thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Estève, Monsieur le Vice-Doyen Maloney. In order to honor the bilingual dimension of Canada, we'll start in French. We'll switch to English after. Juste simplement pour dire que c'est avec une certaine émotion que je me retrouve ici comme conférencier à Sciences Po, parce que c'est une de mes alma mater, Sciences Po. J'y ai obtenu mon doctorat en 1984, vous n'étiez pas né, sous la direction de l'éminent sociologue Michel Crozier, que sans doute plusieurs d'entre vous connaissez par ses écrits. Je remercie la Paris School of International Affairs de m'offrir une telle tribune. Je suis toujours resté en relation avec Sciences Po, notamment en maintenant le contact avec une condisciple qui est devenue l'une de vos professeurs, la professeure Christine Musselin, qui nous honore de sa présence, ainsi aussi en publiant avec le professeur Éloi Laurent, qui est un professeur à Sciences Po, différents textes sur l'enjeu fondamental de la tarification du carbone, dont je n'aurai pas le temps de traiter aujourd'hui. Je voudrais signaler aussi la présence du professeur de Sciences Po, Jacques Rupnik, qui est quelqu'un... Où est-ce qu'il est, le professeur Rupnik? En tout cas, il va peut-être venir, peut-être qu'il est avec les manifestants. Le professeur Tiberghien, que je viens de rencontrer et qui est venu avec un certain groupe d'étudiants. Le professeur Joachim Bitterlich, qui n'est pas de Sciences Po, mais de l'École supérieure de commerce de Paris et vice-président de l'Institut Jacques Delors. Je crois qu'on a aussi, on a aussi Daniel Joanneau, le président de la Chambre de commerce France-Canada, un ancien de Sciences Po. Et nous avons, je crois, aussi Madame Esther Caracsoni de l'IFRI. Et si je ne me trompe pas, il y a quelque part dans la salle Philippe Lambert, le président des anciens de McGill France, qui est ici. Alors, je crois que j'ai mentionné tous mes invités. Beaucoup de choses ont changé depuis ma soutenance de thèse à Sciences Po en 1984, dont l'émergence de la lutte au changement climatique comme enjeu de sécurité mondiale, sujet dont nous allons parler aujourd'hui. Mais une autre chose qui a changé, c'est qu'on me demande de faire cette présentation en anglais, in English, ce qui aurait été peu probable dans le Sciences Po de 1984. Mais bon, j'ai regardé la Constitution canadienne et l'anglais, il figure encore comme l'une de nos deux langues officielles. Le Canada n'a pas changé cela, so it's okay with English. Toutefois, s'il y en a qui veulent intervenir en français lors de la discussion, on s'arrangera pour que tout le monde comprenne. So, I have a 22-page text that will be sent to you electronically if you are registered or if you give us your email. And us means Caroline Roy. Caroline, si vous pouvez vous... elle est déjà levée. Caroline, without her, nobody would be here. So much she worked hard for the preparation of this meeting. I will summarize it for you, the 22 pages text, because I want to preserve as much time as possible for the discussion together. And I will stick to findings and conclusions, and I will skip evidence and data that you would find in the written paper. To what extent climate change is a threat multiplier or a risk amplifier? That's our topic. It's a question that attracts the attention of experts, such as our moderator today, Monsieur Adrien Estève, but there is also now a network of ongoing initiatives coming from security organizations, including the forthcoming NATO Center of Excellence on Climate Change and Security in Montreal. And it's a bit the trigger of my presentation today. We'll have this center in Montreal about climate change and security, and it's the topic I wanted then to address with you. I would say that climate change challenges global security and peace in three ways by which climate change challenges global security. The first that comes to mind, obviously, relates to the increasingly severe disruptive effects of climate change on ecosystems and human habitats. These severe effects are destabilizing the world in ways that potentially increase the risk of conflict. The second concerns more specifically the impact of climate change on military activities themselves. I will not address this issue of effect of climate change on military activities in my introductory remarks, but it is in the written paper, and if you want to discuss the issue with me during when we'll have the session after, I will be very pleased to do so. Third, the third way by which climate change is affecting global security is the climate policies themselves. Climate policies, the policies that we implement to deal with climate change has an effect on the world security. So I will address now in my introductory remarks 2 points: the impact of climate change on global security and the impact of climate policies on global security. So let's start with the impact of climate change on global security. It is simple, intuitive reasoning to attribute a conflict-amplifying effect to environmental disruption and degradation caused by human-induced climate change. It makes sense to predict that anger, violence, and conflict are more likely to occur when things are going badly than when things are going well. Precisely, climate change is making things going badly, going worse in many ways. Extreme weather, catastrophic flooding, prolonged drought, and so on and so on. In the paper, I give all the list of the problems that climate change will create. These physical impacts of climate change on ecosystems and human habitats, and ecosystems that support life, already palpable as global warming is currently 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, are expected to increase because our climate policies are not robust enough to stop global warming, and we're in danger to see global warming reaching about 3 degrees Celsius before the end of this century and continuing global warming thereafter over 3 degrees Celsius. And a world of 3 degrees Celsius is not something that we want to pass on to the future generations. We can expect an increase in competition for food, for resources, and especially for water. Water being, I think, the main challenge of this century. Moreover, climate change effects will aggravate pervasive and entrenched inequalities that are sources of tensions and mistrust. Indeed, climate disruptions are asymmetrical insofar as they have a disproportionate impact on the poorest and the most vulnerable populations. Under such circumstances, many currently fragile states may become more and more chaotic to become even failed states. It is therefore conceivable that the impacts of climate change will exacerbate conflict and violence. But beyond that, experts disagree on the extent to which the effects of climate change actually will exacerbate conflict and violence and will cause conflicts and wars. There is no unanimity between experts to the extent to which this amplifying effect will be strongly amplifying. I believe there are two reasons why experts disagree. The first one is because climate change is an aggravating factor, okay, a threat multiplier, okay, that's true, but its effects never come alone. They are added to other phenomena, strongly mediated by socioeconomic and political factors, so that it is difficult to isolate the impact of climate change. It's very difficult to call a natural disaster a disaster coming from climate change. Will you say this forest fire is about climate change and this one is not? You know it's not possible. You may say climate change will make forest fires more likely, but you cannot identify a forest fire as to have been caused specifically by climate change. So it will be the same when we speak about a migration or a conflict or a war. To speak about a climate war, it will be quite a stretch because there are so many reasons why a war may happen. The second reason why it will be always difficult to isolate the precise impact of climate on conflict is it has to do with human behavior. The human behavior in the face of adversity. Indeed, environmental disasters often arouse a sense of solidarity in human beings. Disasters can strengthen social cohesion and thus reduce the risk of conflict rather than increase it. So what I have said at the beginning, it seems to make sense that the more it's worse, the more you will have conflicts. It's not always true. Facing adversity, people may stick together. The history of water management offers a clear example of this solidarity effect. So far, water disputes have been resolved diplomatically. In fact, through mediation, they have proven to be a source of peace and confidence-building mechanism. If you have a dispute with your neighbors about water, you have to talk with them and to find solutions at the end of the day. And maybe it will help these neighboring countries to learn from each other and to appreciate more each other. However, the problem is that it is not certain that the positive experience of the past about water are a good predictor of the future about water. Climate change will make things worse here again. Climate change impacts are often water-related. Increasing floods, more severe droughts, higher storm surges, sea rise, and so on. Given these aggravating factors, will water continue to be the basis of cooperation for peace, or to the contrary, a major source of tension and conflict? Here again, there is a major unknown. Our capacity as human beings to react properly and implement strategies and policies that will best address water security in the world is a key factor of our ability to make sure that water disputes will continue to be solved diplomatically. So much depends on us and our ability to cooperate together. So that was my first point, the link between the impacts of climate change on the likelihood of conflicts and wars. My second point is about the impact of climate change on military activities, but I will skip it. I'm ready to discuss it with you later. I will go right away to the third way by which climate change is impacting the stability of the world. It is the impact of climate policies on global security. Climate policies. What is it about climate policies? The main challenge about climate policies is to replace oil, gas, and coal. That's the concrete task you need to do, in addition to protect the green areas and the forest and the carbon sinks of the world. It is to replace oil, gas, and coal. Do you think it's possible to replace oil, gas, and coal in a couple of decades without creating a lot of risk about the stability of the world? So that's the issue about the climate policies. The task here is enormous. Replacing fossil fuels, oil, gas, and coal. It's very hard to see how this could not impact global security. Oil, gas, and coal have powered economies in fact, have been the material basis of our world, of our civilization, since the Industrial Revolution, mid-19th century. Today, they still represent more than 80% of the world's primary energy sources, 80%, despite all efforts to replace them with non-emitting energy sources. Oil, gas, and coal are 80% of our source of energy today, as it was in 1990, despite all our efforts. To avoid the worst impacts of climate change, it is necessary to replace hydrocarbons as energy sources, or at least to capture their CO2 emissions, and to do it before 2050 or 2070 at the latest, if we want to avoid global warming of more than 2 degrees Celsius. 2070 is tomorrow. Our countries, most of our countries, I know you come from different countries, but 120 countries, I think, including Canada, France, have committed to be carbon neutral for 2050. That's a very short time to replace the basis, material basis of our civilization, oil, gas, and coal. This is a truly technological, industrial, and energy revolution we are talking about. It represents a colossal task as people are using fossil fuels constantly in their daily lives for transport, goods, heating, everything. The massive energy transition towards carbon neutrality will certainly influence the global security environment and create potentially delicate and conflicting conditions. Only think about the economies that are the petro economy, the petro countries, how they will face that. Some hope that the end of the oil era will be an opportunity to pacify the world. It is true that since the Industrial Revolution, oil has been linked to war and violence in different ways. However, as I said just before about the extent to which climate change is a cause of war, there is no agreement between experts about the extent to which oil is a cause of war. Experts disagree on the extent to which oil is a leading cause of wars. Some hope that if humanity, in order to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions, can get out of its dependence on hydrocarbons, and in particular on oil, then one of the major factors of conflict will be eliminated. They hope that sources of energy as available as the sun and the wind could pacify the world, because there would be no reason to resort to force or threat to obtain sun and wind energy. That is the hope. Replace oil by renewables and you pacify the world. Alas, unfortunately, carbon-free energies will create a new form of dependency. Solar and wind as energy sources and hydrogen as an energy carrier require an immense volume of critical minerals. Critical minerals and materials, critical minerals, critical metals, like cobalt, graphite, lithium, nickel, rare earths, are the building blocks for the clean and digital economy. The more the energy transition accelerates, the more the demand for these critical materials will increase. Without them, you cannot have wind energy, solar energy, hydrogen. And I explain in the written paper why is that so. To have battery, to anything, you need them. These key materials for the energy transition are largely controlled today by China for their extraction and their transformation. The relationship between China and NATO countries, as you know, is problematic. NATO nations and other allies, such as Japan and Korea, already feel far too dependent on powerful Chinese industries and do not want to increase that dependence as the transition to renewable energy progresses. China's control over the critical materials market is all the more worrying, given that China also dominates other key supply chains, such as semiconductors, batteries, and solar panels. The concern is that the Xi regime will increasingly weaponize its dominance and use the export of critical minerals as a leverage tool to pressure client countries into adopting policies in line with the interest of the Xi regime. That's the concern. Europe, for its part, is seeking to get rid not only of Chinese critical materials, but also, as you know, on Russian hydrocarbons. So you have a dual challenge for Europe, a continent that has so few natural resources of its own. There is no Minister of Natural Resources of France or Germany. There is one in Canada since the beginning of the modern life of Canada. Since 1867, one of the most important ministers in Canada is the Natural Resources Minister, but not in Europe. So you have a dual substitution from gas from Russia, critical minerals for China, that Europe must succeed. And this is a huge risk for Europe, for its industrial base, for its global competitiveness, for its environmental and climate objectives, as well as its political and social stability. It is here that the strategic importance of a resource-rich democracy like Canada appears, which currently produces 21 of these priority critical minerals, with dozens of projects in development and many more in active exploration, with the US, Japan, Germany investing big time in Canada. And as ambassador in France, my priority is to bring French investments in Canada as well. There is also an urgent need to promote higher environmental, social, and governance standards for the expanding global market of critical minerals. That's another danger. The extraction of these materials is a booming activity in the handful of countries within which they are highly concentrated. And some of these countries are developing unstable countries, struggling to cope with many social issues, economic issues, environmental issues. If mismanaged, extractive activities for critical minerals will exacerbate conflict and create unsafe working conditions, human rights abuses, and severe environmental degradation. The next few decades will be key. Why? Well, over the next few decades, the world will face the twin simultaneous pressures of greed for fossil fuels and greed for critical minerals. Because the use of fossil fuels is not about to disappear, and their replacement by the advent of renewable energies will take some time. It's a long process. It should not be long. We need to stop fossil fuels now, but we will not. For now, the overall reduction in the use of hydrocarbons is still pending. Global oil demand will increase in 2023. The same for coal. Ultimately, what will be the main challenge of the transition to a zero-carbon economy? I suggest to you, that the main challenge will be people, will be to maintain the support of populations, as well as a high level of cooperation, both within and between countries. There is a risk that such a huge undertaking, carried out in a few decades to become carbon neutral in 2050, 2070, will add to the polarization of the world. Political and safe life risk being increasingly torn between those who find that the transition is going too slowly and are worried about increasingly harmful climate disruptions, and those who, on the contrary, are mobilizing against the apprehended impacts that climate policies can have on energy costs, electricity bills, price at the pump, jobs, tax burden, development prospects, their way of life. A harsh confrontation which could turn violent between those who worry about the end of the world and those who worry about the end of the month would threaten global security and hamper, both within and between states, the high degree of cooperation necessary to a successful and peaceful transition to a zero carbon economy. So you can see, we can see, how much energy, climate, and trade issues have geostrategic ramifications. To conclude, yes, human-induced climate change is a global security risk amplifier, but the bottom line is that there is no deterministic causation between climate impact and armed conflicts. In the face of adversity, humanity can close ranks. Much will depend on the international cooperation that will be put in place thanks to wise and courageous political leadership and professional and effective diplomacy. I'm saying that because I know I speak to many young women and men who want to become diplomat of your country or in international organizations will need your profession, will need a lot of professionalism in diplomacy. Let's only come back a bit to a point I raised, climate policies and the transition to zero carbon economy, risk making democratic states even more dependent on Chinese exports. So what that means for diplomacy? Democratic states want to avoid this position of vulnerability, and that is why they are working together to become more self-sufficient, especially in the supply of critical materials, as we have seen. It will take a whole diplomatic art to help democratic countries put in place this mutual assistance. You have seen all the debates about the anti-inflation bill in the US. So how to make sure that Europe, United States, Canada, Australia, Japan, and so on will be able to develop this mutual assistance. That will require a lot of diplomatic skill, but it's not the only point. It's always easier to have diplomacy between like-minded than it is between countries that are under regimes that you mistrust. So we will need also to maintain necessary cooperation in terms of climate policies with the other regimes, and especially with the Chinese superpower, which has become by far the most emitting country with 27% of global greenhouse gas emissions. In 2016, I remember participating as Minister of Foreign Affairs of Canada in a multilateral conference to help Somalia regain peace and harmony. None of these ministers, myself included, really emphasize the serious problems caused by the longest and more severe drought that Somalia has suffered in the last 40 years. Yet, think about that. How to keep a country functional if it does not rain anymore? That's a problem of Somalia. And to have an international conference where you barely mention this issue, this should never happen anymore. Let me finish by quoting Wangari Maathai Maathai, who became in 2004 the first African woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for her contribution to sustainable development, democracy, and peace. At that time, she stated that, and I quote, "In a few decades, the relationship between the environment, resources, and conflict may seem almost as obvious as the connection we see today between human rights, democracy, and peace." End of quote. I suggested to you today that that decade is upon us now. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Dion, for this presentation. I would say is very nuanced and very, very interesting. And I see that you based most of your claims on research and very hard evidence, and I really praise you for this. So thank you very much for your very comprehensive and at the same time nuanced presentation, especially on the connection between climate change conflict and climate diplomacy at the end. I don't want to be the discussant that hijacks the discussion, so I want you guys to, and the audience in general, to ask questions, students from PSIA, professors and others. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand. I will give you the opportunity to ask them. If you, yeah, straight away. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your speech. It was very clear. I have a very precise question, and particularly regarding Canadian foreign policy. What measures is the Canadian government taking in order to control or influence the actions of their mining companies and energy companies, particularly regarding the territorial conflicts where they have a presence and it's provoking indirect conflict in countries in Latin America and also causing a huge environmental impact? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That's a very important question because Canada is a superpower for mining industry. About 40% of the mining companies of the world are located in Canada. There is a lot of know-how in Canada. And so the danger is that you may have bad players that will tarnish the reputation of the whole industry. So the industry was reluctant to see the government of Canada trying to regulate too much. And they were saying, we have an interest to do it by our own. But Mr. Trudeau decided that we'll need to go further. And so now we have an ombudsman with teeth, able to make sure that the industry respect Canadian law and Canadian regulations around the world. And this has been noticed by the International Energy Agency, which is one of its reports that I quote in the written paper, asked Canada to take the leadership for critical materials, good governance, environmental standards, social behavior. So Canada needs to be a leader about that, and to be as much exemplary as possible. So if personally you have cases of Canadian companies having bad behaviors in your country or anywhere in South America or elsewhere, please then give it to me, the ambassador, and we have an ombudsman in Canada able to do the research and to come with the sanctions. Its sanctions need to be done.
Thank you very much. Again, just raise your hands if you have a question. Yes, there is one over there. And sir, also.
Hey, thank you for your presentation. You gave me a bit of optimism regarding our climate's future. My question is, as climate change is something that affects us all and for generations to come, how do we ensure that partisan objectives don't interfere with a project that's as big as this, not just between countries, but also domestically as well? So, for example, investing in renewable energy, or in the case of Canada, the carbon tax.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased by your premise when you say my talk makes you optimistic, because I feel quite depressed when I think about the challenges we are facing. But I guess you are saying that because I don't lose faith in humankind, that facing all these challenges, maybe we'll try a way to stick together. And that's a big uncertainty, but there is a possibility that we'll be able to avoid conflicts and wars. It's what I was saying. If we are able to see the problem, that we should never have been a conference on Somalia, and the fact that it's not raining anymore is barely mentioned, as we did in 2016. And since 2016, and I'm sure, Professor, you will agree, there is a lot of interest on this topic and a lot of research done, an acceleration of the thought we need to have about the impact of climate on society. And on partisan politics, I mentioned in my presentation, it's not only between states, it's within states. I think you have a polarization of the world, and you see that within countries. And in Europe, for example, it is very difficult now to see in which election you will have the front runner having at least 35%, a third of the vote. Recently, you had an election in Finland, and the winner had 20. The second one has 20, and the third party has 20, 28.8, 20.6. And I remember in the Netherlands, Mr. Rutte remained the prime minister, and he said, "I thank the people of the Netherlands for this massive support." He had 22%. So there is, I think, a fragmentation of politics. There are many reasons for that, but one of these reasons is the disagreement between the end of the month and the end of the world. The ones that are concerned about climate change impacts, and the ones who are concerned about climate change policies. It may make our parliamentary life more and more difficult, in addition to all the reasons why we disagree. And also climate change will increase the impact of inequality, as I mentioned. It will impact more women than men, more people that are poor than people that are rich, even though the rich people are emitting much more. The sense that the ones that are the most guilty are not sharing the burden of the consequences when we contribute to it so little. You will have more difficulties between the North and the South. President Macron wants to, in June, to have another meeting about how the North may support the South. A lot of commitments have been made from the North to the South, even in Montreal against today, last fall, at the conference, at the COP conference on biodiversity. So no, I cannot tell you that there is a magic way by which partisan politics will not interfere in it. We'll need to try to find a way to bring the people together, despite the anxiety that these polarizing issues will create.
There was a question right here, and then.
Thank you. So from Yves Tiberghien from UBC in Canada and PSIA here. You know, the Chinese transformation that you have mentioned is actually very recent. Back in 2009 at Copenhagen, China was harshly criticized, had not started anything. And once I discussed with Xie Zhenghua, I once sat down with him for a couple hours, he said after Copenhagen, and with a lot of intergovernmental work, there was a decision made in 2012 that you know, sustainability would be now at the heart of the strategy of development, and everything will be organized around it. And so then they organized this strategy. And they were pretty clear what they were doing, right? But the rest of the world didn't do it. So the Chinese presence that we see now, which is massive, right? 80% of you know, of many minerals, for lithium is 75%, for solar panel 80%, for batteries is 70%. That's all new. It's post-2012. And also we know lithium consumption will multiply 40 times between now and 2050. And so everyone else can do it too, right? But what it means is we cannot just follow market mechanisms. So that probably means, because the market mechanism, for example, will not develop lithium in Canada, because it's 3 times more expensive than the Chinese one. So is Canada, is the EU ready to get into a world where now there's a competition of green industrial policies? The US is doing it with IRA, Japan is doing it, Korea is doing it. Is that going to be there for a non-liberal world? What does it mean, right, to follow in this direction? Mm-hmm.
Well, Professor, I would describe things differently. I think it's true that China has this advance in renewable energy, but China is ahead of all others in all sorts of energies. It's a country that desperately needs energy and will do everything to find it. Half of the coal of the world is burned in China, half of it. So yes, okay, they are the champions on wind and solar, but they are the champion about the problem as well. And their commitments are very vague. They pretend they will be carbon neutral for 2070. In the meantime, the consumption of coal, the export of coal to other countries continue to go big time. And the reasons why critical materials are so much controlled by China, yes, there is what you said, they invest in it, they took it seriously, they have a strong R&D capacity, inventive people. That's true. But there's the other corner of the reality, is that their environmental criteria are unacceptable for our populations. They are too questionable. And also their workforce is not paid the same than our workforce. And the way they invest in Africa and they took control of the Republic of Congo is something we want to stop to do. And so I think a country like Canada has a lot to do to find a way to take what is good in China, but to avoid what is bad. And to say, yes, there are ways to speed up and to develop rare earths and lithium and cobalt and nickel, but to do it in a way that is acceptable for Canadian people, and that means for European peoples and for our understanding what the world must be. So yes, we have to. I'm not at all in agreement with the people who said we should cut our links with China. What a mistake it would be, but we need to challenge them as well.
Yes, there is a question right here.
Hello, Ambassador. Thanks for being here. My question has to do with the NATO Center of Excellence that's being set up in Montreal. How do you see security actors like NATO, who are kind of emerging climate change actors, how do you see them fitting into the international climate change regime, and what does that mean for Canadian foreign policy in the future?
Yeah. Well, I would suggest, it's a good question, I suggest that you read the book of our animator today, because, our president today, because it's about that. But I just will give you a list of what has been created in the last years from these security bodies. So Adrien would say more. But the UN has a lot of involvement in it, climate lens, Canada as well. In the USA, the Pentagon released a climate strategy for the Army in 2022. And the latest annual threat assessment of the US intelligence community, that means FBI, CIA, list climate change impacts on security among the top global threats. The EU has adopted a climate change in defense roadmap. Since 2019, the International Military Council on Climate and Security brings together experts and military organizations. En France, you have the Ministère des Armées adopted a stratégie climat et défense in April 2022. You see, it's very recent, but it's coming big. La Direction générale des relations internationales et de la stratégie leads l'Observatoire géopolitique des enjeux climatiques en termes de sécurité et de défense. I guess you deal with them often. The Institut des hautes études de défense nationale publishes regularly on the subject, and the Commission des forces armées de l'Assemblée nationale devoted a big study on this issue. So I think it's growing, and it's necessary because the military is a big greenhouse gas emitters, a lot. And it's not known how much exactly, because they don't have to report their emissions. In the Kyoto Protocol, in the Paris Agreement, there is an exception for the military activities. It's considered as too touchy to be reported publicly. But we know it's huge. I think the US Army itself emit more CO2 emissions than 52 countries together. So that's the first reason why they need to be part of it. The second reason is because climate is changing their operations. You don't operate the same if a road is not safe, if floods may happen. So that's the second reason. But the third reason is because a lot of the capacity for humankind to innovate, a lot of the innovations, unfortunately maybe, but it's a fact, came from the military. Computers, internet, name it, a lot of it. So maybe, for example, the ability to find hydrogen for aviation will come from the military, and after we'll go to the civil industry. So there are many reasons why I think, Adrien, you're right to look at this file very closely, in which way the military may be part of the solution and not only part of the problem, as it is the case today. I did not discuss the danger of wars. The moment you have a war, starting with the Agent Orange, you have a lot of destruction for humankind, of course, but for the natural environment as well.
Yes, that's what I was saying. I don't want to hijack the conversation, so thank you very much for asking the question. Yes, sir, go ahead, please.
Oui, bonsoir, monsieur l'ambassadeur. On peut parler en français un petit peu, on est en France. Je m'appelle Philippe Lambert, je représente les alumni de l'Université McGill, and I can also speak in English. I just wanted to mention one prime minister that went to Sciences Po, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, also was here once upon a time. You introduced your topic with water, and I know that Canada has an awful lot of water, rivers, maritime water, and sweet water. And I was just wondering, how could we, it's hard to move water around the globe, but is there something we could do to transform that into part of the solution, on climate and on I don't know, what can we do to make that water more useful? Because I think we have a bit too much for relative to the Canadian population.
Well, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Lambert, pour cette question. Dans mon texte écrit, j'ai toutes sortes de chiffres sur la crise de l'eau. So in my written paper, I have a lot of data about water crisis, and I would like to mention that we have with our Marie-Laure Vercambre, la directrice générale du partenariat français pour l'eau. Marie-Laure, voilà. And I'm pleased you're here because I said in my presentation that I'm convinced that the main issue of the century is water. Unless you have a nuclear deflagration. And by the way, climate change may make it more likely for different reasons. First, I switch to nuclear, I will come back to water. But first, climate change is a reason to use nuclear energy. It's the less emitting source of energy with wind power. And so more countries will do it. The problem you see with Iran will happen with other countries with the justification that, we need to fight climate change. The second reason is because when you have wars, the danger of nuclear conflagration is really big, as we see in Ukraine today. And the third reason is water. You need a lot of fresh water for nuclear energy. And look in France, they need to refurbish their park of nuclear power plants. And the problem of water and the temperature of water is becoming more and more a difficulty in France. So water is the problem for everything. And if you have regions, I think it's 40% of the land of the world that is semi-desertic today, in danger to become desertic completely. And then life is not possible there. You have migration because of that. So we need to address the issue of water big time to make it a priority, and certainly the NATO Center on Climate Change and Security will have to address it. I helped to design a bit what will be the mission of this center, and I insisted on three things. I insisted on the three things I mentioned today, on the impact of climate change on security, should be studied by this center, the importance of the military, and the impact of policies. And in these three issues, water is big. It's a big issue.
Hello. Thank you for your insightful speech, Mr. Ambassador. So what I found very interesting is that you mentioned the cleavages and the societal divisions that climate change is likely to cause in the future. And if I'm not mistaken, you have quite some expertise on bridging societal cleavages yourself in Canada with regards to the Quebec. So what lessons can you draw from these experiences in how to bridge these divisions in society in the future?
Thank you very much for the question. My main involvement in it has been when in 2005, I was the Minister of the Environment, and I chair the COP of that time. A COP, as you know, is a Conference of Parties of the United Nations on Climate Change. It was COP 11, and it has been quite a journey to come at the end with a result that rescued the agreement we had at that time. It was the Kyoto Protocol. The Kyoto Protocol survived in Montreal thanks to the hard work Canada did at that time. And it has been noticed by Canadians so much that when the party that I was a member of, the Liberal Party of Canada, the party was the party of Mr. Trudeau, father and son, had the bad idea to lose the election. And the Conservative government came, and Mr. Harper was not very committed for this issue. He had other problems in mind than to fight climate change. My party asked me to become the leader of the party. So I became the leader of the opposition of Canada, and then campaigning in 2008, at the campaign of 2008, to become Prime Minister of Canada, on a green shift, where I was suggesting that we need to change the way we raise taxes in a country. Instead to tax so much what you earn, we should tax what you burn. So a carbon tax, and then you decrease the income tax, especially the income tax of the people with low leverage, low salary, so low income. So that was the plan, and I've been destroyed by Mr. Harper, who campaigned saying Dion want to tax you on everything, which was not untrue. There was a tax cut and a tax hike, but people took in mind only the tax hike, and we have been defeated. And today, when I cross people on the street in Canada, they stop me and they say, Monsieur Dion, you were so right, but you were ahead of your time. And I am a politician. I see in their eyes that they did not vote for me. Most of them did not vote for me because they didn't know at that time what the CO2 is. Is it Coca-Cola? What he's speaking about? But others did not vote for me because they were already alert and concerned by the issue, but they were purists. They found my policies not demanding enough. And it was true that if I would have been alone, I would have designed something more demanding to fight climate change. But in that time, I said, if I go too fast, people will not follow me. And they did not follow me anyway. So I see that there is a danger to have this polarization between the ones that said, if it's not perfect, I will vote against, and then nothing is done, and the ones that are afraid to do anything. We need to find a middle ground between the two. That's a bit unfortunate because the fight of climate change requests us to ask now, to stop our emissions now. But that is not realistic to me. In order to go ahead, we'll need to have this compromise between the purist and the people of laissez-faire who want to do nothing.
Yes, there is a question here, I think, first, and then, first. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. And you mentioned the importance of climate policies, and you also mentioned Canada's ambition to be exemplary in the domain of extraction and utilization of rare earths and metals. So I was wondering, what is your view on deep sea mining, knowing that it's a Canadian company is set for exploratory operations already this summer? So if you have an answer on deep sea mining and the relation with Canada here.
Well, I would say the same answer, if you allow me, that I said to the gentleman, that it was a lady or a gentleman just before in this corner who asked about the same question. If you have a specific concern about a company, feed me. It is my job to make sure that they are not tarnishing the reputation of Canada and respecting our laws, because our law compel them to respect the Canadian law everywhere in the world. I'm ready to give it to Caroline. Be very pleased. Very pleased to look at that.
Good afternoon. Yes, it works? Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for mentioning freshwater. Just to set the stage a little bit, 2 weeks ago there was the first conference on freshwater at the UN since 1977. So we are very far from what's already being done for climate. One of the outcomes might be that there is going to be a special envoy on freshwater, and we will say, yay. But that's about it. But at least one of its mandates might be to try to make sure that water issues are not dealt in silos as much as they have been dealt in silos so far. And they are, and it's almost inevitable. And my question to you, as maybe as a diplomat, but also as a former minister, is, and also to go back to your question about water on Canadian territory, is that we know that agriculture is the main use, claims the most water on Earth. And so Canada, in a way, has a huge responsibility because the territory is huge and you have a lot of fresh water on your territory, as you were saying. And we see today how we are in a delicate situation because of Ukraine. And Ukraine also produces a lot of water, of wheat because of the size of their territory and because of their soil and their fresh water. And so I was wondering if Canada, if there is a debate in Canada about increasing its role in providing agricultural goods to the world in a sustainable way, obviously, based on that geographic gift, on those. And also, we know that internationally, agricultural goods are produced a little bit erratically. I mean, many countries still aim to be sovereign, and so we produce ridiculous crops in a country that shouldn't use its water to produce these crops. So, and I also wonder if the World Trade Organization has, if you get signals that agricultural goods might be produced according to more environmental dispositions.
About Canada, I would say that the fact that water is so abundant that we have not been always careful. The country was not the first one to wake up, oh, water becomes a problem, so much water is everywhere. But at the same time, we develop a lot of expertise on it, a lot of engineering capacity. And we need to export it more than it is the case now. And the problem is we are not very equipped. Madame Vercambe is the Director General of the Partenariat Français pour l'eau, and she wrote to me and said, who in Canada will lead the presence of Canada at this conference of the United Nations in New York? It took me weeks to discover who will do it with my team. We had so much difficulties. Because we are not equipped for that, we took a bit water for granted. And so the Prime Minister is aware of it now, and the government came at the last budget, Madame Freeland, the Minister of Finance, the last budget said we'll create an institute in Canada responsible for water at the federal level, because we have also provincial provinces that have jurisdictions about water, to try to consolidate our ability to do it in Canada. And then I spoke to the Prime Minister's office right away, and I said, make sure it's not only about Canada, it's about Canada's ability to be a leader in the world. So all countries need now to realize how much this issue will be big and to organize ourselves accordingly. Canada needs to do it, and this conference at the United Nations was a good example where it took a lot of time to figure out, well, by the way, who will lead the Canadian delegation?
I think we have time for one more question, or one or two, if there are other questions. Yes, I think there is one here. Maybe the second one, yes. We can take the two together, maybe, and then have the answer.
Well, thank you so much for coming here and for talking with us. One of my main takeaways from the conversation is basically that can you hear me properly?
Make it louder if you can.
So one of my biggest takeaways from the discussion is actually the barrier between those that worry about the end of the month and those that worry about the end of the world, correct? So my question is specifically how and what tactics is Canada using to actually, from the very beginning and from the very bottom of the people, which is the base, to change that mentality? What allows for the biggest potential in resolving this problem and bridging that gap between those who worry about the end of the month and about the end of the world?
Yes, there is an additional question up in front, and then the final one, and then...
Ambassador, why the Europeans have difficulties to discover Canada as a valuable alternative to China on rare earths?
And then last question in the back.
Thank you so much for your interesting presentation. I was wondering about the Canada's expansion of raw material extraction and how you ensure the well-being and protection of Indigenous communities at the same time.
Oh, sorry, I did not hear at all.
It's very hard.
How do you ensure the protection of Indigenous communities while extracting minerals from Canadian ground?
Okay. Alors, we have 4 questions, I think. The end of the world against the end of the month. Canada alternative for China. We have 2, 3, and 3. And the third is indigenous communities. About the end of the world and the end of the month, I think we'll not succeed without social justice involved in climate policy. My view when I tried to become the Prime Minister of my country is that you need to bring economic growth, social justice, and environmental sustainability together. If you isolate environmental sustainability, as some purists would like to do, they will lose the people. And the people will not vote for you. And if they don't vote for you, they will vote for the climato-skeptics that are often linked ideologically with the anti-immigration parties. It's a bit the same political family in Europe, it's very clear, and the US as well. We need to avoid that. And for that, the best approach we may have on social policy must come to the rescue about the best policy we may find on environmental and climate policies. It's not easy to do because the climate policy makers, they want to act now. I understand, I fully understand. But I'm a political scientist by profession. And if you lose the people, you do nothing. And there are so many politicians willing to do nothing, to say to people, oh, don't believe these intellectuals in their world, keep your way of life, I will protect you, I will build a wall to protect your world. That's true about ethnographic tensions in our societies, but it's true about climate tensions as well. To replace oil, gas, and coal when people need it so much, it's not an easy task. So I would suggest to try to make sure that you have strong environmental approach in parties that care about economic growth and social justice. So that's not the magic answer, but I think it's needed. It's the bottom line. Canada alternative to China. That's a good question, Herr Bitterlich, but it's not easy to replace China. Anyway, in our society, to build a new mining company, to start a new mine, to bring the resource to the market, according to the International Energy Agency, I give the number in my paper, I think it's something like 12 years. So between now and 2030, China will remain the leader. So it's why we need to deal with China. It's why President Macron, I think, is right to be in China today. But we need indeed to strengthen our ability to give alternative, to avoid a too big dependency to a regime that we do not trust. And this is why Canada, Australia, countries that have a lot of resources and still not so big populations, must be part of the solution. The job of an ambassador in Europe, and Amy will say, I'm sure is the same than me. Amy Baker is number 2 at the Canadian Embassy. The job of a diplomat in Europe, a Canadian diplomat, until February 24, 2022, when Putin started his awful war against Ukraine. Before that, it was to say to Europeans, okay, you like us Canadians, but you need to realize that you need us as well. You like us, but you need us. After the war, it was the opposite. All of Europe was knocking our door and saying to Canadians, we need you tomorrow, bring everything. And then we had to say, we will, but bring your investments. We need huge amount of investments to be sure that this cobalt, this lithium, this nickel, that is somewhere in the tundra in the north of Canada, will come to the European market. It will not be done tomorrow, and it will request a lot of cooperation between us. And it will be done properly with strong regulations, because it's what our populations want, including, third point, the indigenous populations of Canada. And we have rules that are very strong now, that it's very difficult to go ahead with a project of development if the project is on the land of a community and the community doesn't want it. That's almost impossible to do. So you need to have the agreement of the communities. You need to involve them, to work with them, and a lot of Aboriginal Canadians that I know, they want to do it. They want to develop their communities. They want these investments. They want to do it properly, but they are not in agreement with the traditionalists who want to do nothing and say that each tree is a kind of god, you cannot cut it. You have the same difficulties within Aboriginal communities than in the whole society. The fight for development and the fight to change nothing is everywhere. And to me, when I was the minister, I was meeting a lot of Aboriginal leaders telling me, Stéphane, we need to develop the community properly, but it must be done. And if the resource is there, we need to exploit it properly, but together. Don't leave us alone anymore, we'll not accept it. I think it's the right approach.
Well, thank you very much. Do we know it's over? Okay, thank you very much. So I think we can give a round of applause for our speaker. Thank you, Ambassador Dion. If you have any questions and if you want to circulate the text, I think you get it. Caroline is right here, so don't hesitate to ask us. And see you around for another discussion on climate change, security, and geopolitics. Thank you.